Today, we're diving into a law that really gets to the heart of a huge dilemma for any democracy. Where do you draw the line between keeping a country safe and protecting the freedom of its citizens? We're talking about India's National Security Act.
So let's just start with a pretty startling question. Can you be put in jail without ever being charged with a crime? Now, you'd think in a democracy, the answer would be a simple, obvious no. But under one very controversial law in India, it's not only possible, it's a legal reality.
And if you want to understand just how contentious this law is, just look at this number. In a single year, one high court went through 120 detention orders made under this National Security Act. And you know what they did? They threw out 94 of them. That's almost 80%. It really makes you wonder, is this law being used the way it was intended?
So what exactly is this law? The National Security Act, or NSA, is what lawyers call a law of exception. And that's a fancy way of saying it operates outside the normal rules. It gets to play by a whole different and much harsher set of rules than our regular justice system.
The whole idea behind it is this concept called preventive detention. And this is the key thing to get. This isn't about punishing someone for something they've already done. It's about being proactive or anticipatory. The government can detain someone because they suspect that person might do something in the future that could threaten public order or national security. You know, this power to detain someone without a trial, it actually has a really long and pretty controversial history in India. You can draw a straight line from rules made back in the colonial era, like the infamous Rowlatt Act, all the way through post-independence laws, including one called MISA that was so misused during the emergency that it had to be repealed. The NSA, which came along in 1980, is really just the latest chapter in this long, complicated story.
So, how does this law actually work in practice? Let's break down the nuts and bolts of how the NSA manages to bypass the standard legal system we're all familiar with.
Okay, so here's how it goes down. The government issues a detention order, and poof, a person can be held for up to a full year without any formal charges being filed. They're supposed to be told why they're being detained, but the authorities can actually wait up to 10 days to tell them. And get this, the case doesn't go before a regular court. Instead, it's reviewed by an advisory board made up of legal experts.
And this is where you can really see the difference. On the left, you've got the rights you'd expect in any normal arrest. You're told why immediately, you have a right to apply for bail, and you have to see a judge within 24 hours. But then you look at the NSA column, and it's like all those fundamental protections just evaporate. And probably the most critical one, a detainee has absolutely no right to a lawyer when they go before that advisory board.
This whole thing really boils down to one fundamental clash, doesn't it? It's this incredibly difficult balancing act, this constant tug of war between what the state sees as necessary for security and what we see as our fundamental right to individual liberty.
And believe me, this isn't a new debate. Way back when India's constitution was being written, this exact issue was on the table. Dr. B.R. Ambedkar himself, one of its chief architects, argued that in really exceptional times, the interests of the state might just have to come before the liberty of one person. And that reasoning became the original justification for even allowing something like preventive detention in the Constitution.
But there's an incredibly powerful counter-argument, and it was brilliantly stated by Justice H.R. Khanna. He argued that your right to liberty isn't some gift that the Constitution gives you. It's a basic human right you're born with. He's basically saying that the entire foundation of a civilized society rests on the idea that the state can't just take away your freedom without a proper legal reason.
Okay, so enough with the legal theory. Let's move into the real world. What does this law actually look like for real people on the ground? What's the human impact?
Now, to get a sense of how these kinds of tough laws can play out, let's look at data from a similar law, the UAPA. And what you see is a pretty worrying trend. Between 2018 and 2020, nearly 4,700 people were arrested under it. But the number of people actually convicted? Just 149. Now, this isn't NSA data, but it shows a pattern. These laws can lead to thousands of people being locked up, often for long periods, without ever being found guilty of anything.
Critics often point to cases where the NSA seems to be used to silence voices of dissent. A really well-known example is the case of Dr. Kafil Khan, who was active in the anti-CAA protests. Now, a regular court actually granted him bail, but then the government slapped the NSA on him, which kept him in jail anyway. It's like a legal trump card.
And we're not just talking about individuals. These laws have been used on a massive scale against entire movements. During the protests against the Kunnamkulam nuclear plant, thousands of people, over 8,000, were detained under these kinds of laws. Sure, many of the cases were thrown out later, but by then, the damage was done. The protest was effectively chilled.
And this is where it gets even more troubling.
There are serious concerns about who this law is being used against. We've seen reports from places like Muzaffarnagar that suggest the NSA is used disproportionately against marginalized communities, like Dalits and Muslims, sometimes for really minor arguments that would never normally call for such a serious law.
Okay, this right here. This data from 2021 is just staggering. Look at it. Out of the 483 people who were detained under the NSA that year, almost exactly half were later released because the authorities found no valid grounds for their detention. Just let that sink in for a second. That means for every one person who remained in custody, another person was jailed for what was ultimately found to be nothing.
So after hearing all this, we're left with a huge question. Can and should a law that so many people have called draconian be reformed?
Well, legal experts and civil liberties advocates have put a lot of ideas on the table. Some of the big ones are replacing that advisory board with actual judges, guaranteeing the right to a lawyer, which seems like a no-brainer, and adding something called sunset clauses. That would mean the law automatically expires unless Parliament actively votes to keep it. And of course, there are calls for more transparency and for holding officers accountable when they misuse the law.
And so we end right where we began, with that fundamental and incredibly difficult dilemma. In a democracy, a place that's supposed to value both safety and freedom, where exactly do you draw the line? The National Security Act isn't just a law on a piece of paper. It is a constant, challenging test of how India chooses to answer that very question.